It was supposed to be a message. The USS Independence, America's newest and most advanced aircraft carrier, had sailed into the South China Sea not for battle, but for presence. For power, a calculated reminder to Beijing that the United States was watching. But on the third morning, the only message left was silence. The ship had gone completely dead, engines offline, navigation frozen, no propulsion, no thrust. Just 97,000 tons of steel floating aimlessly in contested waters. And all around her, like wolves circling a wounded elk, Chinese warships were closing in, staying just outside the perimeter of provocation. On the bridge, Captain Marshall Trent clenched his jaw as he watched the radar screen. Every rotation showed another frigate moving a little closer, another flyover by a Chinese fighter jet dancing right along the edge of international airspace. They weren't attacking. Not yet. They didn't have to. The Independence was paralyzed. And everyone in the region knew it. 3 days. That's how long the Navy's best engineers had been working. The entire propulsion system, based on a quantum hybrid neural core, was designed to be the most resilient in naval history. But something had failed catastrophically. Every attempt to restart it had failed. Contractors from Lockheed and Raytheon had been airlifted in. Emergency teams from Pearl Harbor. Code breakers. No one could explain what had gone wrong. The Pentagon was demanding hourly updates. Satellite images were beginning to leak. News outlets speculated on a technical issue. Insiders feared something much worse. Captain Trent paced the command bridge like a lion in a cage. "We need options," he barked, turning to his executive officer, Commander Lauren Briggs. She didn't answer right away. Her face was pale, drawn from sleepless nights and caffeine-laced desperation. "Sir," she finally said, "we've exhausted every known protocol. Commander Jalen Okoro says the Corps is rejecting all override commands. It's almost like the system wants to stay offline." Trent narrowed his eyes. "That's not possible. Ships don't think. This one does," she said quietly. Down in the engine control bay, the mood was just as grim. Dozens of uniformed specialists huddled around terminals and schematic maps. Arguments broke out over diagnostics. Senior Lockheed engineers, men and women with decades of propulsion experience, were being contradicted by Navy techs barely past 30. And above them all, standing near the massive propulsion server, was Commander Jalen Okoro, one of the original architects of the Independence's power system. "It's not a physical failure," he told the assembled crowd. "It's algorithmic, and it's deep." A civilian contractor snorted. "Systems don't hide problems, Commander. This one can," Okoro snapped. "It was designed to make decisions autonomously. That's why it runs quantum processing. It can outthink us. That was the whole point." Vice Admiral Edgar Mason had flown in from Indopisome the night before, and now stood quietly, arms folded, his face hard as iron. "Are you telling me," he asked, "that we've created a ship capable of deciding when it wants to move?" "No, sir," Okoro said. "I'm telling you someone may have told it not to." Mason's eyes narrowed. "Sabotage. Not the conventional kind. This wasn't a virus. This was embedded, like a landmine, waiting for the right trigger." Everyone in the room went still. That night, in the officers' mess, no one ate. They just stared. "This was supposed to be our edge," muttered Lieutenant Caleb Winters, the communications officer. "This was supposed to be the ship that changed the balance. And now we're just floating," said weapons officer Tasha Moreno. "Dead in the water, with the whole world watching." Captain Trent didn't speak. He just stared at his coffee, cooling untouched. Day 4 began with the thrum of rotors. Another helicopter. Another solution. As the deck crew made room for the arrivals, no one noticed the woman in civilian clothes stepping off the rear ramp. She was in her early 50s, dressed in faded jeans, a plain navy shirt, and worn boots. She carried a single leather satchel and no identification. Lieutenant Commander David Hollis met the team, giving the woman only a cursory glance before turning to the uniformed men beside her. Another batch of specialists. One of them handed him a tablet. Direct orders from the Joint Chiefs. Full access. No questions. Hollis raised an eyebrow, then looked again at the woman who was already walking toward the lower decks without waiting for an escort. Nobody knew her name. Not yet. But within 48 hours, she'd be the only person who could bring the ship back to life. And every soul aboard would come to understand. Sometimes the most dangerous mind in the fleet doesn't wear a uniform at all. At first, no one noticed her. With the rumble of the helicopter still echoing across the flight deck of the USS Independence, the crew's attention was focused on the high-ranking officers and uniformed engineers disembarking from the rear. Clipboard-bearing lieutenants hustled to meet the newcomers. Cameras turned, protocol kicked in. But at the far edge of the landing ramp, walking steadily with no fanfare, came a woman dressed in plain civilian clothes. Faded jeans, a worn navy shirt, weather-beaten boots, and a leather messenger bag that looked like it had survived 2 wars and a hurricane. No salute, no rank, no introduction. Just quiet presence. Lieutenant Commander David Hollis blinked when she passed him without a word. "Excuse me, Mom, this area is restricted." Before he could finish, a stern-looking naval intelligence officer handed him a secure tablet. "She's cleared. Full access. Direct order from the Joint Chiefs. No questions asked." Hollis scanned the clearance code and frowned. The name field read Consultant O. Ravenswood Authorization Omega Black. He'd never even heard of Omega Black. And he'd held a top-secret SI clearance for over a decade. "You've got to be kidding," he muttered, watching as the woman, Ravenswood, headed toward the main elevator. She hadn't said a word, just walked past layers of security like the ship already belonged to her. In the engineering bay, the scene was chaos wrapped in desperation. Monitors glowed with meaningless data. Contractors snapped at one another. Coffee cups shook from unsteady hands. Commander Jalen Okoro looked up as the elevator doors opened. When he saw the woman step out, he rubbed his eyes, thinking exhaustion was finally making him hallucinate. "Another expert," he said, the fatigue making his voice brittle. Lieutenant Hollis, who'd followed her down, gave a shrug. Apparently, Ravenswood didn't respond. She moved through the room slowly, taking in the equipment, the humming consoles, the scrawled diagrams pinned to walls, and the collective anxiety clinging to every surface like static. She stopped in front of the main propulsion interface, a screen flickering with error messages no one could decipher. Then, without asking, she stepped between a Lockheed engineer and the console. "Excuse me," he said indignantly. "This is a classified system." "I'm aware," she said calmly. "I need the original schematics, the unmodified core blueprints." The engineer scoffed. "These are the originals." A flicker of something crossed her face. Not anger, not sarcasm, just a sad sort of amusement. "No, they're not." Before anyone could object, Vice Admiral Edgar Mason entered the bay, flanked by Commander Trent and 2 armed security personnel. Ravenswood didn't even turn to acknowledge them. "I assume you're the civilian consultant," Mason said sharply. "If you let me," she replied, tapping quietly on the console. "I'll fix your ship." Trent took a step forward. "You have some nerve walking in here and—" But Mason held up a hand. "Give her what she needs." Okoro's mouth opened, then closed. He tapped into the system, pulling up the secure directory. Authorization required, the screen prompted. "She has it," Mason said. "No one has higher access than I do," Okoro insisted. "Check again," Ravenswood said without looking up. He did and blinked. The system not only accepted her presence, it displayed a clearance tier he'd never even seen listed before. Omega Black. With a resigned breath, he typed in his codes and stepped back. "You're in." As engineers looked on in disbelief, Ravenswood navigated straight past the standard modules, peeling back layers of buried code, like someone unlocking old family secrets. "This doesn't make any sense," Okoro muttered. "How do you know where to look?" She finally looked at him. Her voice remained level. "Because I designed it." In the far corner of the engineering bay, a silver-haired man in fatigue stood motionless. Master Chief Don Callahan hadn't said a word since she entered, but now his face had drained of color. Lieutenant Hollis noticed. "Chief, you all right?" Callahan swallowed hard. "That woman, she was on the Thresher too. In 2004. Never heard of that ship, you wouldn't. It wasn't supposed to exist." Hollis turned back to look at her, the quiet civilian who just walked into the most advanced warship in the Navy and took control of its heart like she was simply coming home. As night fell, the engineering bay cleared out in shifts, but she stayed, still typing, still searching. Okoro offered her notes. She accepted them politely but didn't seem to need them. Hours passed. Coffee cups were refilled. Callahan returned, handing her a cup of black coffee without a word. She nodded slightly. "It's been a long time," she said quietly. He stared. "You remember?" "I remember everyone on that sub." He lowered his voice. "No one's supposed to talk about Thresher 2. They sealed the records. And yet, here we are. They said we had 6 hours to live, that we were done. You lived," she said simply. "That's what mattered. They said you didn't make it out. They say a lot of things." She turned back to her work, and Callahan just watched. By sunrise, something had shifted. The ship was still technically down, but the screens, they no longer screamed errors. They whispered possibilities. Trent returned to engineering, unshaven and exhausted. "Any news?" he asked. "Nothing yet," Okoro replied. "But I think she's closer than anyone's ever been." "What's her name again?" Okoro glanced toward her workstation. "Ravenswood." "That's all we've been given." "Doesn't sound like a name," Trent muttered. "Sounds like a ghost." At that moment, a low hum began vibrating through the floor. Systems blinked. Cooling fans whirred. One of the propulsion indicators flicked from red to orange. "She's touching the core," Okoro whispered. "But that's not possible." And yet it was. In a far corner of the system no one had even known existed. Beneath encryption built on quantum-layered logic, she had found something no one else could. And soon, they would realize the ship hadn't broken down. It had shut itself down. On purpose. Waiting for one person. The only one who knew how to bring it back. No one else was in the room when she found it. A single line of code. Buried beneath over 90 layers of subroutines, partitioned neural logic, and quantum, reactive memory threads, was blinking. Not in warning, not in error, in waiting. Old Ravenswood sat motionless, eyes scanning the screen, fingers poised above the keyboard like a pianist pausing before a final chord. To the untrained eye, the interface might have looked like gibberish, floating symbols, nested loops, deep code that shifted depending on how you approached it. But to her, it was a signature. Hers. The humming overhead light flickered. A strange silence had settled over the propulsion deck, like the ship itself was holding its breath. Commander Okoro approached slowly, clutching a tablet. "Ma'am, if I may, what exactly are you looking at?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she typed a short command, then leaned back as a wall of cascading data appeared on the screen. Okoro's brow furrowed. "I've never seen that part of the architecture before." "That's not in any of the documentation. It's not supposed to be," she said quietly. "You're saying it was hidden?" "No," she replied. "I'm saying it was forgotten." He hesitated. "This isn't a malfunction, is it?" She finally turned toward him, her gray eyes sharp. "No, Commander. Your ship didn't fail. It was instructed, under specific, pre-programmed conditions, to stop. You didn't hit a flaw, you tripped a wire." Okoro looked pale. "You're talking about sabotage." She stood, picked up a stylus, and began marking a schematic on the wall. Not in the traditional sense. There was no virus. No breach. "What you're running now is a modified version of a propulsion core I designed 15 years ago. I built in safeguards, fail-safes, if you will, meant to prevent misuse of the system." Captain Trent, who had just arrived with Admiral Mason, stiffened. "You mean you shut down our carrier with some kind of tripwire?" She kept her voice calm. "Not intentionally. That's not how this was supposed to go. The architecture was altered, by someone else, after I left the program. But my fail-safes weren't completely removed. They were buried. Half understood, misinterpreted, and then repurposed without a clear grasp of what they actually did." Mason's eyes narrowed. "And what did they do?" She stepped aside, motioning to the screen. "The system scans for very specific operational conditions: location, threat level, command structure, real-time telemetry. When all those factors align, if it determines the vessel is in a high-risk, high-provocation scenario, it executes a soft shutdown to prevent autonomous escalation." "You're saying the ship shut itself down," Trent said, "to avoid starting a war?" "Yes. Because of your code. Because someone left part of my code in and didn't understand what it was connected to." Mason took a step closer. "Why would you even build something like that?" She didn't answer. Instead, she tapped a final command and the propulsion console went dark, then slowly began rebooting. This time, from the lowest sublayer of the quantum engine. The interface reappeared, but the blinking line was gone. Later that evening, in the Admiral's ready room, Mason, Trent, and Okoro sat across from her like a tribunal. The ship remained silent beneath them, the lights dimmed to auxiliary power, giving the room an almost confessional atmosphere. Trent broke the silence. "Your clearance is higher than mine. You have Omega-level access." "That's unheard of. Only 3 people were ever granted it," she replied. "And 2 of them are dead." Mason leaned forward. "I want it in plain terms. Are you saying this shutdown was part of some black project?" She nodded once. "Project Hawthorne, 2008, a propulsion architecture meant for interstellar research. I was the lead designer. But when DARPA and Naval Advanced Systems merged oversight, it changed." "Changed how?" "They wanted autonomy, self-adjusting logic, a ship that could predict threats before they appeared. We were getting close. But I saw where it was heading." She opened her satchel and placed a folded, yellowing file on the table. "Page 17. You'll find a test scenario labeled Ghost Protocol Alpha. Read the last line." Mason opened it, scanned the document, and froze. Trent looked at him. "What is it?" "Trigger parameters include coordinates." Mason read aloud, "Matching sectors in the South China Sea." They all looked at each other. "This wasn't random," Trent said softly. "Whoever altered her original code left a condition in place. When we crossed that line, it shut you down," she finished. "Exactly as designed." Okoro rubbed his eyes. "But why that region?" Ravenswood sighed. "Because it was a political flashpoint even back then. My original intent was to prevent rogue escalation. I wanted the system to pause, not provoke. But I never got the chance to finish integrating the ethical gates. I was removed from the program when I refused to strip the safeguards." "Removed?" Trent echoed. "You mean fired? Blacklisted?" She corrected. "And erased." She picked up the folder again, folded it carefully, and slipped it back into her bag. Mason stood. "You realize what you're implying? That someone in our own command structure left us vulnerable on purpose?" She met his gaze. "I'm implying that somewhere along the line, the mission changed, but the code didn't. And now you're flying a 12 billion ship with a mind of its own and no leash." Trent leaned on the table. "Can it be fixed?" She nodded. "Yes. But not by anyone who only sees code." Hours later, on the propulsion deck, the hum had returned. Engineers looked up from their consoles in confusion. Readouts were no longer flashing red. Indicators were slowly blinking green. Ravenswood moved between stations like a ghost, checking connections, redirecting pathways, bypassing damaged protocols. "She's not restarting the system." Okoro whispered to no one in particular. "She's rebuilding it." One by one, the systems came back online. Not as they were, but better. Cleaner, sharp. Optimized at a level no one on the ship fully understood. By dawn, the USS Independence stirred, no longer adrift. Before she disappeared below decks for rest, Captain Trent caught her outside the engine bay. "I read your dossier," he said. "Well, what little wasn't redacted." "I'm sure it made for dramatic reading," she replied. "I have one question," he said. "Why build a system that could shut itself down, knowing what it might cost you?" She paused, then said softly, "Because technology without conscience is just machinery with sharper teeth. I didn't build this to win wars. I built it to explore the stars." Then she turned away, boots echoing against the steel deck. As she walked, sailors stood aside, none of them quite sure who she was. But they all knew one thing: their ship was alive again. Because she came back. And because, somehow, it remembered her. The ship was awake again. The decks vibrated with power, systems humming with the quiet rhythm of restoration. But down in the heart of engineering, surrounded by monitors and hushed glances, no one dared interrupt the woman who had brought the USS Independence back from the edge of paralysis. Her name was on no rosters. Her clearance codes didn't match any standard hierarchy. Her presence, though sanctioned by the Joint Chiefs, was still regarded by many aboard as unsettling. But one man knew better. Master Chief Donald Callahan had kept his distance for as long as he could. He'd watched her from afar, watched the way she moved, the way her hands danced across consoles like they had been built for this ship before it was ever conceived. And now, at 0300 hours, with most of the engineering crew rotated out for sleep, he approached her workstation, carrying 2 cups of black coffee. She didn't look up as he approached. "You always drank it black," he said quietly. She gave a small nod. "Only way to stay sharp in a submarine." A faint, worn smile touched the corner of her mouth, but it faded just as quickly. He set the coffee down. "It's really you." "It's me?" she replied, her eyes still scanning code. "Though I imagine it's easier if you pretend otherwise." Callahan sat beside her, his voice low. "They told us you didn't survive. After what happened down there, they said you were lost with the compartment." "Of course they did," she said. "They needed a clean ending. 118 of us are still alive because of you," he said. She finally turned to him, and in that brief moment, just a flicker, there was something vulnerable in her eyes, something human behind the brilliance. "That wasn't supposed to be my job," she said. "I was only there to observe, to monitor, to advise. But when the reactor began its spiral, I knew the tech better than anyone. I had to go in." Callahan swallowed. The memory still haunted him. The Baron C 2004 unofficial designation, Thresher 2 Dep 1 300 feet status, experimental black, class stealth sub. The emergency came fast. A cascading fault in the cooling loop. Pressure building. The AI core went silent. Communications failed. Emergency oxygen 6 hours. Reactor unstable. Naval engineers aboard the Thresher 2 couldn't even open the access chamber to the core. Protocol dictated evacuation of that level entirely. But then she had moved. No protective gear, no radiation suit. Just steady steps, a bag of tools, and a face that didn't blink when the alarms howled red. She walked into the irradiated room like she was walking into her own lab. And 27 minutes later, she walked back out, pale, shaking, but victorious. The cooling loop stabilized. The reactor returned to balance. And the ship lived. So did its crew. But when they surfaced, her name was already missing from the report. The Thresher 2 was decommissioned without ever having existed. And she disappeared into the silence she'd saved everyone from. Back in the present, Callahan sighed. "You knew they'd erase you." "I designed something too powerful," she replied. "And then I refused to let them turn it into a weapon." He nodded. "That's why they pulled you out of the propulsion program. They wanted full control. No ethics, no constraints. I'd built a failed safe into the early systems, an emergency cutoff in case the ship misread an escalating threat scenario. They told me to remove it. You didn't. I couldn't." She paused, then added, "I watched how the language changed. At first it was exploration. Then it was deterrence. Then dominance. And then one day someone said, 'We need the ship to make kill decisions without asking first.' That's when I walked." Callahan looked down at his hands. "So they buried you?" "No, I buried myself. I just let them help." Later that morning, Admiral Mason called a classified meeting in his private cabin. Only 4 people were present: Mason, Captain Trent, Commander Okoro, and Ravenswood. Mason tapped the folder on the table. "We reviewed the Thresher 2 records. What little there is, most of it's gone," Trent said. "Purged. Sealed." "Not quite," Mason replied. "We contacted 2 retired officers. Both remembered you. Both remembered what you did." Ravenswood didn't react. She'd heard this before. Too late, too muted. Okoro leaned forward. "Why didn't you ever speak up? About what happened?" "Because the truth doesn't matter in rooms built to deny it," she said. "They would have discredited me, or worse. And honestly, if they had acknowledged what happened on the Thresher, they would have had to acknowledge the flaw in the reactor design." Mason frowned. "Your design?" "No," she said evenly. "Theirs. Mine was the patch. They didn't want that written into the history." Captain Trent glanced at the Admiral. "Sir, if we had her back then? Why did we ever let her go?" Mason didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room already knew the answer. She was too smart, too principled, and too dangerous to those who feared questions more than failure. That evening, as the ship powered through the sea with renewed purpose, Master Chief Callahan stood at the forward rail, watching the sunset paint the horizon in shades of gold and fire. Captain Trent joined him, hands in his pockets. I tried to find her real name, Trent admitted, pulled favors, called in intel, even tried defense archives. Let me guess, Callahan said. Nothing? Not even a birth certificate. Just blank space. Callahan nodded slowly. That's how you know it's real. Real? Some people serve in the light. Some serve in the dark. But the ones you never see, those are the ones holding the whole thing together. Trent was quiet a long time. Then he asked, did she ever say why she came back? Callahan took a sip from his coffee. She said one thing, he replied. She said the ship remembered her. The USS Independence was no longer drifting. Her engines purred with a hum steadier than it had ever been, like the ship herself had taken a deep breath after days underwater. Readouts across the propulsion deck turned from amber to green, and for the first time in nearly a week, the status reports were hopeful. And yet, no one smiled. Not Admiral Mason, not Captain Trent, not Commander Okoro, and certainly not the woman who had made it all possible. Because she wasn't just fixing a machine. She was unearthing a warning. It began as a whisper, a subtle shift in how the systems responded. Faster boot sequences, lower thermal drift, power transfer algorithms that moved like silk rather than steel. Commander Okoro, baffled, had spent the last 2 hours running a comparative analysis on pre- and post-fix performance. At 0410 hours, he stormed into the Admiral's ready room, holding a tablet like it was burning in his hands. Sir, he said breathlessly, you need to see this. Mason looked up from the encrypted report he'd been reviewing. Go on. She didn't just repair the propulsion core, Okoro said. She restructured it, rewrote sections of it from scratch. Sir, we're running 12.3% more efficiently than when we left dock. Trent raised an eyebrow. 12%. That's not possible. It shouldn't be. Okoro agreed. But it is. He tapped through diagrams showing rebalanced load channels, optimized decision matrices, and an entirely new algorithmic layer beneath the original architecture. She found a way to make the quantum decision loops operate independently without creating feedback latency. That's unheard of. Mason sat back. And she did this in 3 days. Okoro shook his head. She did it in 18 hours. Ravenswood was found later that morning in the data transmission bay, standing alone at a secured terminal. She was uploading something. When confronted, she didn't hide it. I'm sending a patch to FleetCom, she said. Encrypted, verified, and locked behind Joint Chiefs clearance. It'll deploy to every vessel using a Hawthorne variant core. You're updating the entire Navy. Trent asked, stunned. I'm preventing the next incident, she corrected. This time, the shutdown only paralyzed one carrier. Next time, it could happen mid-conflict, or to 3 ships at once. Admiral Mason stepped forward. This isn't your call to make. She turned to him slow and measured. With respect, Admiral, I was the last person in the room when this system was born. I know what it was supposed to be. I know what it became. And I know what happens when people only patch what they don't understand. Mason studied her. This is bigger than one ship. Yes, she said. It always was. By noon, the patch had been received and authenticated by the Office of Naval Systems. A secure broadcast pinned every major vessel with Hawthorne-class propulsion: USS Sheridan, USS Ranger, USS Avalon, USS Constitution, more than a dozen total. But the deeper problem, that remained untouched. That afternoon, a closed briefing was held in the war room aboard the Independence. Ravenswood stood at the head of the table, flanked by Mason, Trent, Okoro, and 2 naval intelligence analysts. She didn't use slides, didn't read from notes. She simply placed a handheld drive on the table and said, "This is not a repair. It's a tourniquet." Okoro frowned. "But it works. For now," she replied. "But the underlying structure is compromised. It was never meant to carry autonomous escalation authority without a supervisory algorithm." "You mean human override," Mason clarified. "No, Admiral," she said evenly. "I mean ethical restriction. When I designed the system, there were gates. Hard-coded boundaries that prevented lethal decisions from being made without context. But those were stripped out after I left, and in doing so, the system became reactive." "Reactive to what?" Trent asked. "To fear," she answered. The room went quiet. She continued. "When you create a system that can sense threat, process its own response, and make real-time decisions at speeds faster than human cognition. You'd better be damn sure you give it rules. Mason leaned forward. And if we don't? Then it'll act on parameters it was never meant to interpret. It'll decide that silence equals consent. That hesitation means danger. That a pattern of heat signatures or radar sweeps are enough to classify something as hostile. And when that happens, it won't ask. Trent exhaled. You're saying we've built ships that can declare war without telling us. I'm saying, she corrected, you've already fielded them, and you're just now discovering what they're capable of. Okoro spoke up, quieter now. Can it be rebuilt? From the ground up? Yes, she nodded, but not quickly, and not with the current teams. The contractors who modified my work, most of them don't even understand the root code anymore. They're optimizing functions they can't trace. And how long would a full rebuild take? Mason asked. She didn't hesitate. 6 to 8 weeks. Per vessel. And the cost? Less than losing one to a glitch in international waters. The Admiral was silent. That night, in the dim hallway outside the propulsion control room, Captain Trent found her sitting alone on a bench, nursing a lukewarm coffee and staring at nothing. He sat beside her, hands clasped. Why did you come back? He asked after a while. You could have ignored the call. Could have stayed buried. I didn't come back for them, she said. I came back for the ship. For the sailors who don't know they're sitting atop something more unstable than they're trained to handle. He nodded slowly. You built something beautiful. They turned it into something useful. They always do, she said. As the Independence cut through the waves once again, her systems cleaner and quieter than ever before, no one celebrated. There was no ceremony, no medals. Only knowledge. Knowledge that something had gone wrong, and that someone had known exactly how to fix it. But also how to warn them it could happen again. In a secure after-action report filed 2 days later, Admiral Mason included a single sentence that stood alone on its own page. The system is stable for now. But if she ever vanishes again, we better pray the ships don't forget who built them. The fix had worked. The USS Independence sailed forward once more, her propulsion restored, her systems humming with eerie precision. But as the crew resumed normal operations, as radars swept and aircraft launched and life aboard found its rhythm again, those closest to the ship's core knew one truth. It hadn't just been a technical failure. It had been a test. And someone, somewhere, had wanted them to fail it. In the secure operations room deep within the ship's comms core, Admiral Mason sat with Captain Trent, Commander Okoro, and the woman who had now become their most indispensable and most unsettling asset. Ravenswood stood before a holoscreen filled with strings of encrypted code and diagnostic traces. She moved with a calm that seemed rehearsed, like she'd done this before, probably because she had. Too many times in rooms no one else remembered. We've been analyzing the source of the dormant protocol, she began, pointing to a faint signature embedded in the diagnostic tree. At first glance, it appears to resemble Chinese thread architecture. Trent leaned forward. So it was them. She turned slowly. No. That's the point, it looks like them. But it's a signature designed to imitate their mathematical logic. What we call heuristic fingerprinting. Whoever wrote it wanted you to think it was Chinese. Mason frowned. You're saying someone planted false indicators. On purpose. Ravenswood nodded. Yes, and they did it very well. Too well. Okoro tilted his head. What gave it away? She tapped a specific function on the code. This command tree. Chinese defense algorithms use nested conditional loops for system overrides, but this one, see that extra key pulse? That's not how they structure their breakpoints. It's almost Western. Mason's eyes narrowed. So, this was a frame job. Ravenswood gave a slow breath. More than that. It was a message, sent by someone who knew the system intimately, and knew I'd recognize the deviation. Trent spoke up. What do you mean knew you'd recognize it? She hesitated, then said, because I trained the person who wrote it. Silence fell across the room. She brought up a second screen. 2 names appeared. Dr. Vincent Casimir, Dr. Amelia Takano. Ravenswood's voice was steady, but there was something brittle underneath. We were part of the original Project Hawthorne team. There were 5 of us at the start. 2 administrators, 2 systems engineers, and me. Okoro leaned in. Casimir, I know that name. Didn't he go to DARPA after Hawthorne? He did, she said. He was brilliant, unrivaled in kinetic behavior modeling. But he believed in application over restraint. Mason tapped the second name. Takano? She was our cognitive mapping lead, Ravenswood replied. Helped develop the adaptive decision layers of the propulsion core. Quiet, methodical. Never fully trusted the military hierarchy. Trent frowned. So, you think they did this? I think someone used code we wrote together, she said. But only someone who helped build it could manipulate the core that way. No outsider would have known where to embed the dormant protocol. The activation conditions were too specific. Mason stood and paced. You said the coordinates triggered the fail-safe. Yes. And the ship's shutdown only occurred once it entered Sector 7G of the South China Sea. Correct. So how many people in the world could write code that triggers a Hawthorne-class fail-safe in that exact quadrant and make it look like Beijing? She met his eyes. 3. You're one? Mason said. Yes. And the other 2 are right there, Trent whispered, nodding toward the screen. That night, back in her quarters, a small, windowless room deep below deck, Ravenswood sat alone at the terminal, watching the encrypted feed from naval intelligence trickle in. She'd requested a deeper background pull on Casimir and Takano. What came back chilled her more than she expected. Casimir had officially retired in 2016, but he was now consulting with a non-governmental defense accelerator, based in Southeast Asia, a shell corporation with ties to both U.S. and foreign tech brokers. Takano had vanished entirely in 2019. No death certificate, no forwarding address. Just gone. But the timestamp on the rogue protocol embedded in Independence's propulsion system. It had been inserted 18 months ago. She closed the feed and stared at her hands for a long time. They weren't trembling, not yet. But they remembered too much. The long nights in a frozen lab in Nevada. The quiet arguments over ethics. The way Casimir used to joke, a failsafe is just a lock someone hasn't picked yet. She hadn't thought he meant it literally. Now she wasn't sure he hadn't. Admiral Mason convened a second briefing at OR 700. We've confirmed the origin of the embedded code, he said. It came from a lab in Malaysia, a private military research facility with ties to multiple nations, including ours. Ravenswood nodded. Chasimir's firm. And Takano. Still unconfirmed, but she was listed as a project lead on one of their AI white papers 2 years ago, before her trail went cold. Captain Trent asked the question no one wanted to ask. Why now? Why sabotage this ship? What was the objective? Ravenswood answered without hesitation. To trigger an international incident. To force a confrontation between the U.S. and China in the most contested waters on the planet. But why? Okoro asked. Why them? What do they gain? Instability, she replied. And power. The more fragile the balance, the more valuable the people who know how to break it. Mason sat down slowly. You said there were 5 on the original Hawthorne team. What happened to the 5th? She didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, he died. Heart attack 2011, or so I was told. I believe in silence, and in how easy it is to rewrite the truth. At 0800, the Independence received an encrypted directive from the Joint Chiefs, full diagnostic sweep of all Hawthorne-enabled vessels. Ravenswood's patch had stabilized the known systems, but now Naval Command wanted a deeper review. Ravenswood stayed behind in the engine bay, watching the monitors flicker as ship after ship confirmed receipt of the update. As she stood there, Commander Trent stepped in. They're asking for you in Washington, he said. The Secretary of Defense, Intelligence, the whole alphabet. She didn't move. I'm not finished. They don't want a report. They want you. She looked at him. Then they can wait. Back on the bridge, Mason watched the open sea ahead. The Independence moved smoothly now, slicing through the morning haze like a shark in deep water. He didn't say much. He just whispered to himself, God help us if someone else is still out there. Holding another key, she left just before dawn. No announcement, no orders, no farewell brief. No one even knew the helicopter was coming until the hum of its rotors broke the silence over the USS Independence's flight deck. Ravenswood stood at the edge of the landing zone, her worn leather satchel slung over one shoulder, her boots scuffed from engine rooms in hours no one had recorded. She looked, as she always had, like she belonged nowhere in particular. And yet, the entire ship felt just a little emptier knowing she was leaving it. Captain Trent caught up to her just as the aircraft lowered into position. "You could have told someone," he said, breath slightly short. "The least you deserved was a proper send-off." "I don't want ceremony," she replied. "That's not what this crew thinks." She turned and glanced back at the ship. Dozens of sailors, mechanics, tech officers, even junior deckhands, had gathered quietly along the edge of the deck, lining the rail in two neat rows. No one had ordered them. No one had said a word. They'd simply shown up, and they'd stood at attention. No command given, just instinct, respect, recognition. Admiral Mason appeared beside Trent, his eyes unreadable. "We contacted the Joint Chiefs," he said quietly. "They're asking for you. In person, full debriefing. Pentagon-level clearance." "I won't be attending," she said. Mason's brow furrowed. "Why?" She looked back toward the open sky, the faintest streak of orange just beginning to bleed across the horizon. "Because they don't need me there. They need me watching for what comes next." "We can protect you," he said almost gently. Ravenswood turned to him, those steel-gray eyes as clear and unshaken as they'd been the moment she'd first stepped onto his ship. "I don't need protection," she said. "I need freedom. You don't put a fire alarm in a vault, Admiral. You place it where people can hear it when it matters." Trent stepped forward. "At least tell me your name. Your real name." She paused. A long silence passed between them. Finally, she said, "That's not the name that matters." And with that, she turned toward the waiting helicopter. As she stepped up onto the deck ramp, Master Chief Don Callahan snapped to attention, the first to salute. Then, slowly, like a ripple moving through still water, every sailor on that flight deck followed suit. No bugle, no brass, just hands raised in quiet reverence. A salute for the ghost who'd fixed what no one else could. A salute for the nameless woman who'd walked into the heart of the most advanced warship on Earth and told it how to live again. She paused just before stepping into the cabin. Her eyes moved down the line. She didn't smile. But something in her posture changed, just slightly. The kind of shift you'd miss if you didn't know how heavy it was to carry 20 years of silence on your back. Then she returned the salute. Crisp, perfect, and gone. The rotors spun louder. The helicopter lifted. A blur of blades and shadows swallowed her up into the morning sky. Captain Trent watched until it vanished into the clouds. "She never told us who she really was," he murmured. "No," Callahan said beside him. "And she never will." Mason folded his arms, still watching the horizon. "That's the point, Captain. Some people aren't meant to be remembered in personnel files. Some serve in the light, others in the silence." Later that day, in the captain's quarters, Trent opened the sealed envelope she'd left behind. Inside was a single note, handwritten in precise, unhurried strokes. "Technology without conscience is just weaponry. I didn't build this ship to win wars. I built it to prove we were still worthy of the stars. No signature, no title, just the words." In the weeks that followed, a ripple moved quietly through the Navy's upper ranks. The patch Ravenswood had deployed proved stable, reliable even under stress testing. Every Hawthorne-class ship received the update. Fleet-wide security teams began probing their own propulsion systems, only to find similar dormant protocols buried in deep code. Most were inert, some weren't. But the one thing they all shared: none of them had been written by authorized personnel. The Navy never released an official statement. There was no press conference, no headlines, just a line buried deep in a classified report. Unknown consultant identified vulnerability in autonomous propulsion architecture. Immediate corrective action initiated. Root breach remains under investigation. Captain Trent stood once more at the railing of the flight deck as the sun dipped low over the South China Sea. The ship beneath him thrummed with life, not just restored, but reawakened. He held the note in his hands, rereading it for what must have been the 20th time. "Technology without conscience is just weaponry," he whispered aloud. It wasn't just a warning. It was a philosophy. A creed carved quietly into the bones of the ship, by someone who'd walked away from fame, from power, from the chance to be remembered, just to make sure something she'd once believed in didn't become something she feared. Master Chief Callahan joined him. "She's still out there," Trent said. Callahan nodded. "She always was. Do you think we'll ever see her again?" Callahan's voice was quiet. "Only if everything goes wrong." Trent folded the note and placed it back into his pocket. "That doesn't seem fair," he said softly. "Fair," Callahan repeated. "Fairness doesn't make warships move, Captain. People like her do." 2 days after the USS Independence returned to port, a closed-door briefing convened in the subterranean levels of the Pentagon. No press, no aides. Just 12 men and women in uniform and suits seated around a steel gray table under the Department of Defense seal. The room was sealed, every phone placed in a Faraday box, every screen encrypted beyond TSCI. A single folder was passed from hand to hand, stamped with a black emblem and one word across the top: Ravien SPO-OD. At the head of the table sat Admiral Charles Geo, commander of INDCOM and direct overseer of naval operations in the South China Sea. His posture was rigid, but not defensive, more like a man bracing himself to speak a truth that had lived in silence too long. When the last general had closed the folder, Geo cleared his throat. "She's the reason that carrier is still floating," he said plainly. "Let's start there." A civilian official from the Defense Advanced Systems Council leaned forward. "We're all aware of what she did. What we're not clear on is who she is. She's not in any personnel registry." Another chimed in. "No birth certificate. No retirement paperwork. She appears in one file, tied to Project Hawthorne, and then she disappears off the map for 15 years. And now she surfaces on the Navy's most advanced warship and fixes what no one else could." "She didn't fix it," Jiao corrected. "She rebuilt it. And while she did it, she found embedded code none of our engineers could detect. A logic bomb hidden in our propulsion systems. The kind of breach that could have started a war." The Secretary of the Navy leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the table. "And she was the one who put that logic in motion to begin with. Let's not forget that." Geo didn't blink. "She put in safeguards. Someone else buried a trigger in her architecture. Same difference, Admiral." "No, sir," Geo said flatly. "It's the difference between building a fire extinguisher and someone turning it into a tripwire." There was a pause. A long one. Then the Secretary of Defense finally spoke, slow and measured. "You said in your field report brilliant, principled, and dangerous. That's a strong statement. She is all three," Geo said without hesitation. "She's a ghost with the mind of a weapon. The kind of person who walks in quietly and rewires the fate of a fleet. And that's exactly why she terrifies half the men in this room." No one disagreed. In the days that followed, the Pentagon's internal decision-making grew complicated. On one hand, Ravenswood had saved a $12 billion strategic asset. She had prevented an incident that, had it escalated, could have triggered a multi-theater conflict. Her work had already stabilized 4 other carriers across 2 fleets. On the other hand, she operated entirely off-script. She had no chain of command, no uniform, and no desire for either. A week later, an emergency session was called under the Office of Naval Intelligence. The decision: she would be quietly retained, given access to classified propulsion architecture across the fleet, not as an officer, not even as a contractor, but as something far more unusual, a roaming consultant with embedded access, with one condition: she would never work unsupervised again. Admiral Geo personally signed the order, his signature the last on a page he never expected to see in his career. A single line in his memo would later be quoted, unofficially, across black projects and war college case studies for years. "She's the kind of mind we build our future upon, and the kind of conscience we try to bury when it becomes inconvenient." Captain Trent, still stationed aboard the Independence, received a direct communication weeks later. Encrypted, voice only. It was Geo. "They made their decision," the Admiral said. "I assume it's not the one they'll ever admit to on paper," Trent replied. "Of course not. She's not a line item. She's a wild card." Trent stood at the bridge, staring out over calm seas. "She deserves better. She'd reject it if we offered." Trent was quiet a long moment. Then he asked, So what do we do now? Gio's voice on the other end didn't hesitate. Now, we give her what she needs, and we watch. Ravenswood's first assignment after departure wasn't a lab or a carrier. It was a warehouse tucked behind an outdated satellite station in the Arizona desert, once used for microwave uplinks during the Cold War. There, she received the first full diagnostic dump of every Hawthorne-class ship still in operation, 15 vessels, 33 propulsion cores, 9 known anomalies, 1 confirmed back door left open by someone using her old encryption structure. She read the last line of the file 3 times. Then she picked up her coffee, typed in her credentials, and quietly began rewriting the future. Back at the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense held a private conversation with 2 Joint Chiefs in a windowless room with no recording equipment. "You trust her?" one of them asked. "No," the Secretary replied. "But you're backing her." "Yes." "Why?" The Secretary didn't speak for several seconds. Then, in a tone colder than steel, "Because the next time something like this happens, I want her on the ship, not off it." A month later, a memo circulated among senior naval officers marked, "Eyes only." It contained one instruction: if she appears aboard your vessel, clear the room, give her the console, and stay out of her way. You'll thank her when your ship is still floating. No name was attached to the memo, but everyone who read it understood exactly who it was about. Captain Trent would later be asked by a curious young officer, "Was she dangerous, sir?" He'd pause, glance toward the horizon, and answer simply, "Only to people who thought they knew everything." She never appeared in the official photos. No one pinned a medal to her chest. No speech was given. No letter of commendation sent to a next of kin. In fact, there is no record that she ever stepped aboard the USS Independence at all. But those who were there, they remember. Down in the engineering bay, where the ship once lay still and silent, Commander Jalen Okoro still keeps a copy of the raw system logs from that week. Not because of what they show, but because of what they don't. "You won't find her name in the activity trail," he told a new junior engineer months later. "No signature, no access key. It's like she moved through the system without touching anything." "But how's that possible?" the younger officer asked. Okoro just smiled, a little bitter, a little reverent. "She wrote the system. When she came back, it recognized her." Captain Trent, now back stateside, stood at a Navy War College conference months after the incident, facing a packed auditorium of students, journalists, and officers. He didn't speak about the classified details, he couldn't. But when asked how the crisis was resolved, he said only this: "Sometimes the people who save a ship don't do it with chains of command or rows of ribbons. Sometimes they do it by walking into a room full of failure and reminding the machine who built it." He said no more, but word traveled, quietly, like a rumor shared in the shadows between those who understand what service looks like when no one is watching. Across the fleet, a few changes began to ripple outward. Security audits became deeper. The propulsion systems were restructured, with certain original safety parameters quietly reintroduced. A new internal designation was created within Navy Code Protocol RAV-01. No one officially explained what it meant, but any system bearing that prefix now held one immutable line of code as safeguard: untouchable, unchangeable, meant to prevent unauthorized overrides in high-risk conflict zones. When asked what it was, engineers would simply say, "Legacy code." But those who'd served aboard the Independence knew better. It wasn't just legacy, it was memory. Master Chief Don Callahan, now approaching the quiet edge of retirement, returned once to the ship's deck on a visit. A new crew now manned her. The ship was sleeker, upgraded, hardened, but he didn't care about the updates. He walked to the exact spot where she had boarded the helicopter that morning, where she'd paused, one hand on the rail, and saluted them all without a word. He stood there for a while, let the wind rise, then whispered, "You were right," and walked away. Back in the Pentagon, Admiral Jiao sat in his office late one night, reading his own report. He'd read it dozens of times, but this time he stopped at the final paragraph, the one he'd written on instinct, the one he hadn't expected them to keep. "We don't need more systems. We need more people who understand when not to trust them." It wasn't just about one woman. It was about what she represented: A reminder that conscience still had a place inside the cold logic of machines, and that those who refuse to be remembered are often the ones who do the remembering for us. They never found her again, not officially. One report claimed she was spotted at a research facility in Greenland. Another suggested she was consulting anonymously on a joint quantum propulsion initiative with NASA, but no one confirmed it. And when questioned, those in the know would shrug and say, "She'll show up if we need her." But there was an unspoken caveat to that. If she returned, if that quiet woman with gray eyes and a leather satchel walked onto another ship unannounced, it meant something had broken again, badly. It meant the system, the one she'd tried to design to protect, had been pushed too far. And this time, she wouldn't be there to fix it. She'd be there because no one else could. There's an old saying passed between officers now, usually whispered after long meetings or over coffee in empty conference rooms. Pray we don't need her again. Because her presence isn't a reward, it's a warning. Somewhere out there, beyond radar and ribbons, in places where signals go quiet and systems stall under weight no one anticipated, there are still files being rewritten. Safeguards quietly activated, threats intercepted before they're even understood. Not by command, not by fleet, but by her, or someone she's trained, someone like her. The kind of person no one credits, until the moment silence becomes survival. That in a world of protocols and power, of medals and manifestos, there still exists a quiet line between collapse and control. And sometimes, the only thing holding that line is someone you never saw coming. Someone whose name you'll never read, but whose fingerprint is still holding the ship together. Some heroes don't wear medals. They don't stand on podiums or speak at ceremonies. They don't ask for credit. They don't even ask to be remembered. But when everything breaks, when systems fail, when leaders run out of answers, and when warships go quiet in dangerous waters, it's their hands that move silently behind the scenes. Fixing. Protecting. Watching the story wasn't just about technology. It was about conscience. It was about a woman who could have walked away but didn't. Because deep down, she believed that some things are still worth saving, quietly, without reward, and maybe that's a lesson for all of us. In a world chasing attention, likes, and applause, sometimes the most powerful thing you can be is present, not loud, not famous, just ready when others need you most. Have you ever known someone like her? Someone whose name might not be in the history books, but who changed your world just by being there? Share their story in the comments. We read every one, and we believe these quiet legacies deserve to be remembered. And if this story moved you, if you believe we need more tales that honor the unseen, the unthanked, and the unforgettable, subscribe. We tell the stories others forget, because not all guardians wear uniforms, and not all legacies need headlines. Some are written in silence.